I thought we'd have a little fun this week with a story that's always fascinated me. I was reminded about it recently and had to revisit the details because I couldn't remember them all. But it's a humorous and a sad tale of friendship, betrayal, and animosity. And it involves that was a dinosaur. We all have dinosaurs, right? And so didn't the two men in the following tale. So much so that their obsession with the fossilized remains of these mysterious creatures led to a bitter feud that consumed both men for the rest of their lives. Their feud has a name, too. It's called the Bone Wars.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Our little tale, or big tale, begins in Berlin in 1863. It was there that two young men, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, met. Cope was 23 and Marsh was 32, and they took a liking to one another. Marsh was the more educated one of the two, being older, and he also had 2 university degrees. He'd studied at Yale and also at Andover. Cope's formal education had ended at 16, and he was touring Europe to educate himself. He was visiting museums, he was writing papers, and all of this despite his lack of schooling. There were rumors, too, that he may also have been in Europe to escape the Civil War draft, but really that's a matter of conjecture. Regardless, Cope came from a somewhat wealthy Quaker family in Philadelphia and had written 37 scientific papers to Marsh's 2 papers. I'm sure Marsh was impressed, if maybe not a little jealous, of the younger man's natural intellect. And Marsh wasn't no slouch either. He was also, well, have to say, not liked by some. He lacked the natural charm that Cope seemed to wield so easily. One woman once described that being around Marsh was
like running against a pitchfork.
I'll have to remember that one. As I mentioned, they got along well in Berlin. Marsh showed the younger Cope around. They visited museums, they dined together, and they shared their fascination about the recent discoveries of the great lizards named dinosaurs. And they were named by the noted and somewhat infamous biologist Richard Owen 2 decades before. After parting company, they continued their friendship through letters. And then, 5 years later in 1868, well, things began to change. Cope had been digging around for fossils in a quarry located in Haddonfield, New Jersey. And it wasn't just any quarry. 10 years prior to this, in 1858, a nearly complete hadrosaur skeleton had been found in that spot. Marsh had since become a professor of paleontology, which was the first such appointment in North America of a professor of paleontology, and he accepted Cope's invitation to visit the quarry. During their time at the quarry, they found more fossils. It must have been exciting for Cope. He was only 28, pursuing his dreams of chasing down dinosaur fossils and working alongside a Yale professor. Like I said, an exciting time, until it wasn't. Cope would later write,
"Soon after, in endeavoring to obtain fossils from those localities, I found everything closed to me and pledged to Marsh for money considerations."
The feud had begun. It took an even worse turn not too long afterward when Cope prepared the fossil of an elasmosaurus for display. Now, the elasmosaurus was a type of plesiosaur that had an extremely long neck. Think of the Loch Ness Monster, and you have the right idea. Cope made a mistake, however. Cope placed the skull at the end of the tail instead of the neck. It feels like it would be a legitimate mistake, and given this is the early years of paleontology and discovery, one can forgive that mistake. Marsh didn't. He pointed it out, and he did so publicly. And Cope was justifiably embarrassed. From that point on, while they continued to exchange letters, they weren't as amicable as they had once been. What began as a friendship had devolved into a feud. And that feud began to spill out of the letters and into the pages of scientific journals, like the American Journal of Science, where they began to call each other out. Both men were prolific writers, and they used the printed word as one of the primary battlefields for their ongoing conflict. However, the public spats between Cope and Marsh were not limited to scientific journals. Cope, feeling aggrieved by Marsh's tactics, eventually took the feud to a broader audience by leaking stories of Marsh's unscrupulous practices to the New York Herald. How bad did it get? Well, it got pretty bad, actually. It wasn't out of the question for either man to dynamite the quarry they'd been searching in after they were done, just so the other couldn't exploit it later. Cope took to keeping a journal documenting all of Marsh's mistakes so he could publish them all later. And in the meantime, Marsh had other plans. In 1874, the Black Hills of South Dakota were officially part of the Great Sioux Reservation and therefore off limits to non-Native Americans according to the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. However, gold was discovered in the area, leading to a gold rush and an influx of miners trespassing on Sioux land. Around this time, Marsh saw an opportunity. He managed to secure an introduction to Red Cloud, a leader of the Oglala Lakota Sioux, through his contacts at the Department of the Interior. Marsh promised Red Cloud that he would lobby in Washington, D.C. for Lakota rights in exchange for exclusive access to the rich fossil beds in Sioux territory. So this successfully blocked Cope from doing the same. Their battle bled over into Wyoming in an area known as Como Bluff, which was said to be rich with fossils, and hoping to secure the findings and discoveries for themselves, both men set up camp there. They spied on each other and continued to do everything in their power to undermine their rivals' work. To say Como Bluff was rich with fossils would be an understatement. It was essentially a boneyard, which contained more fossils than one could count. Pulled from its dirt were fossilized remains of Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, and many others that are too numerous to name. And to top it off, Cope and Marsh didn't relegate their battle to letters and devious measures in the field. They went public with their feud in a very, public manner. They attacked one another in the newspapers and journals. In 1890, the New York Herald, which I mentioned earlier, published an article about the feud titled, "Scientists Wage Bitter War." And, bitter it was. So much so that the prestigious scientific journal, The American Naturalist, refused to publish any more articles by either man, telling its readers in 1873 this:
The controversy between the authors in question has come to be a personal one, and because the naturalist is not called upon to devote further space to its consideration, the continuance of the subject will be allowed only in the form of an appendix at the expense of the author.
5 years later, Cope would buy half the rights to that very journal when it was put up for sale, hoping to use it as a means to publish his own work. And where did this battle lead? Who claimed victory? Which man came out on top when all was said and done? Well, neither one did. In fact, not only did their public squabbles hurt their reputations, it also did so the reputation of American paleontology for decades. Cope and Marsh were so adamant to outdo one another that their rush to beat each other to name discoveries led to many specimens of the same animal being named and renamed. This eventually led to confusion and redundancies that are still being worked out today, well over a century later. Now, their battle cost them their funding and also their credibility. Not only did it affect their professional lives, but it led to ruins in their personal lives as well. Cope and his wife eventually separated. Marsh never married. He was too busy fighting Cope and digging for fossils. And both men suffered financial losses almost too great to endure. And the war between the two raged on, even until the end. Cope died in 1897, but his parting shot was to let science decide who was the better man. He asked that his brain be preserved, and he urged Marsh to do the same. Let their brains determine who had the higher intellect. Well, Marsh scoffed at the idea. He may have lifted a glass and had a chuckle over Cope's death, but he wouldn't have long to celebrate. He wouldn't quite make it to 2 years. He died 23 months later. Did they leave any legacy to be proud of? Well, they did. Despite their animosity and questionable tactics, they collectively discovered thousands of fossils, many of which were new species unknown to science. And the reading public hasn't changed much. Even back then, good feuds sold papers, and it also led to an increased interest in paleontology, which was a field of science most people had never heard of. Not to mention the attention it drew to the great beasts who once walked the earth. That fascination with dinosaurs hasn't dimmed. As far as the theory of evolution is concerned, both men contributed to it. Cope noticed a trend in the fossils he uncovered. Lineages often increased in size over time, and this trend came to be known as Cope's rule. It's still talked about today and studied. In 1880, Marsh wrote a book called Odontorhynths, a monograph on extinct birds of North America. And this book explored the evolution of birds and also their connection to dinosaurs, especially when it came to the fossilized remains of birds with teeth. Charles Darwin, who published his great book in 1859, was forever on the lookout for discoveries that supported his theory of evolution by natural selection. He was so impressed with Marsh's work in that book that he wrote him a letter dated August 31st, 1880.
I received some time ago your very kind note of July 28th, and yesterday the magnificent volume. I have looked with renewed admiration at the plates and will soon read the text. Your work on these old birds and on the many fossil animals of North America has afforded the best support to the theory of evolution, which has appeared within the last 20 years.
Not bad. The Bone Wars, despite being a time of fierce competition and, unethical practices, ultimately led to a wealth of discoveries and a significant advancement in the field of paleontology. Here's to you, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. May you both rest in peace. And Cope's brain? Well, it's still around, as is his skull. It is said that you can find his brain preserved at the Wistar Institute and his skull at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. In the early 1990s, Cope's skull toured the country with photographer and filmmaker Louis Sahoyos. Marsh's remains, they remain firmly underground. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and if you find value in this show, please consider supporting it at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to keep the show alive and without ads, and I can only do so with your assistance. So help spread the word, share the show with your friends. At evolutiontalk.com, you'll also find information, recommended books, and ways to contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.